being aware that we have an hour, because after this there will be the official opening and things like that. I'd love to start. And for that, I will share this presentation. So welcome everybody online in the room. And the focus today is on IoT and sustainability, as there is much to do in this world where we are confronted with climate change. And we see that we really need to rely on technology to help us wherever we are. So for that, I would tell a little bit about the Dynamic Coalition on IoT and which its aims are, after which we go into the specifics of sustainability. So Dynamic Coalition in the IGF framework is a coalition that continues to work towards the goal up and beyond the IGF meetings itself. And in IoT, the focus is on the benefits and the challenges that we have on a global level.
Because nobody realized.
Welcome. Take a seat. So really it's about new technologies to bring us ways to respond to today's challenges. Is there more people coming?
Yeah, Olivier is outside. People have realized that it's starting.
And which
Can I go and shout?
Sorry, my people online, there seems to be a logistical problem here, which is going to be resolved by Roberto Gaetano right now.
Sometimes you need an Italian to move people. Oh.
It's the same system as next door.
Okay. Good. Sorry for this. 3 minutes after the start, we'll restart. Welcome to the meeting organized by the Dynamic Coalition on the Internet of Things, one of the IGF Dynamic Coalitions that is continuously work to progress work in between the IGF meetings and progressing common understanding about how good practice looks like on a global level. I'm here joined at the table by Olivier Capelle-Leblond.
Hello.
He's also leading the Dynamic Coalition on core internet values, which are very fundamental for the way we build up the internet. And online we have Talant Sultanov, who will share about his activities relating to climate change monitoring and disaster warning. Joanna Koletsa from the University of Lodz, who also has, who is legal expert and understands how this fits into from a legal perspective in the global framework. Jonathan Cave, who is an economist and a game theorist, but also connected to the Alan Turing Institute and look very much into it from an ethics perspective. And last but not least, myself. I have the opportunity to organize this IoT and Dynamic Coalition, and have been doing so with a lot of pleasure. So today's focus is on IoT and sustainability, which is one of the aspects we're looking at this year, next to IoT and data governance, IoT and the impact of AI, responsible AI, and how we deploy this into those areas in the world where less technical knowledge and less infrastructure is is present. IoT and sustainability clearly touches upon the latter as well. So IoT benefits and challenges are abound. Basically, we do need those new technologies. This is why we try to progress them and try to progress them in a safe way. At the same time, technologies can be used and abused, but technologies are not good or bad in themselves. It's how we use them. And we can see that we can address a lot of challenges, but also need to protect it from becoming a challenge. Specific issues that we look at is the SDGs, global warming and its effect, and global health issues such as pandemics. And to be able to do this successfully, you do need to share global knowledge about solutions and local knowledge and action to make things happening, as well as what you need to take into account to make sure that there is no mishaps. There's many applications, really opening your mind. It ranges from a pressure tension meter in your veins to what you see the buoy is tsunami measuring network in the world. And we'll have some explicit examples shortly. The global approach is necessary because otherwise you're dependent on local deployment of things that are made around the globe and not always taken into account what is important for people. But we cannot rely on individual legislation by countries or on the ethical stance from producers as such. We need to create this common understanding of what could be expected and what should be expected from IoT providers, both services and devices. As such, IoT is merely a specific aspect of the internet, just like social networks, communication, access to information, but it has specific characteristics. For instance, it collects, stores, and provides access to many data that it observes by its actions and its sensors. These data can be relatable to people. They also can be relatable to situations that may allow both good things and bad things to happen. Autonomous networks with actuators, more and more of that thanks to AI, where IoT is both the eyes and the ears, but also the hands and the feet of the networks and what's happening. And of course, there's the possibility to weaponize IoT devices to attack third parties. The most innocent one is that somebody may log into your home network and put your heat on, which comes with a lot of costs and a bit of sweat. But of course, there you can see that if it's connected to medical devices or if it's connected to bridges, that other mishaps may happen as well. So the Dynamic Coalition on IoT is set up in 2008 and active ever since to develop that global good practice. What we see is that most IoT dialogues take place in silos with single stakeholders like producers, like governments, how to deal with it. But it's so important to meet on this together and on equal terms at global level, as to ensure that it can be deployed in the global public interest. Many years of discussion, as you can see, I've grown older, the internet's grown older. IoT has boomed since. Even Vint has grown older.
Does
The
it
principle-
never grow older?
Yes, and you
I don't
grow
think
older
Vint
too.
grows older at all. With Vint.
The principle that we related to this is that Internet of Things good practice aims at developing IoT systems, products, and services, taking ethical considerations into account by the outset, both in the development, deployment, and the use to help. To create a free, secure, and enabling rights-based environment. The future we want is the text we used. I would say people first today. So the thinking on IoT in summary is that it's there to embrace societal challenges in an ethical way, to create an IoT environment that encourages also investments. One thing, without investments, nothing will happen and progress will be slow. And last but not least, ensure the emergence of a trusted IoT environment, not one that we need to be worrying about. Meaningful transparency, clear accountability, and real choice are at the core of that. So, user agency, transparency, and ethical approach are key in that. And I see Olivier nodding heavily in this. So the agenda for today, I'm opening the floor shortly to Talant Sultanov. After that, Joanna will talk about the principles of international law that back up the whole approach towards climate change and disaster warning. Jonathan Cave will go into the economic and regulation aspects, as well as the ethical aspects from his background. And last but not least, Olivier on the core internet values relations. At any point in time after a presentation, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll give you the opportunity to talk. And at the end of the time, we'll, if there's time left, we'll continue with other questions and answers. And of course, we'll be present here afterwards as well. So with this, I'm going to move to Talant Sultanov. Please, I'm launching your presentation. Share. Sorry that I'm not super fast in this, but I think we show it on. So Talant, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here and to present the experience of how we have been applying IoT technologies here in Central Asia. And my presentation is called IoTs for Disaster Risk Management, how to use low-cost weather stations in Kyrgyzstan's challenging terrain. Next slide, please. And before we move on to the presentation, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions as a quiz, and you can put your responses in chat. And actually, these are very relevant questions to the presentation. One question is, where is the world's longest line of sight? And maybe a bonus question to that, who has the world's record of sending signal the longest distance over Wi-Fi? And second question is, what is the relationship between OB1 and LoRaWAN? I look forward to your responses in chat. Next slide, please.
I'm looking in the room here, I see stunned faces, wondering. Anybody knows any guess?
Longest line of sight.
You got their attention, Talant.
Great, great. That was the purpose. So the longest line of sight is located not in the Mount Everest or in other parts, as I thought initially. It's actually located in Kyrgyzstan. There is a peak, Dankova, on the border with China. And from there, you can see a peak in China called Hindu-Tak. And these two peaks are over 540 kilometers away from each other. And this wasn't just a kind of trivia question. This was a fact that helped us to establish contact with scientists who have set world records on sending signals over long distances based in ICTP in Trieste. Marco Zenaro and Ermanno Pietro Simoli. Thanks to this fact, we got in touch with them and proposed how about they beat their own world record. And they came back to us and they said, well, how about we actually do something useful and do research on deploying IoT network for climate monitoring and sending this data to long distance. And that's how our project started. Next slide, please. And they proposed a technology called LoRaWAN. For us, it sounded very interesting because it sounded like Obi-Wan. And the relationship is that both are able to send signals to long distance. LoRa means long range. And both are actually trying to save the world. So next slide. And before we move on to the technology, I'd like to give you a little context about Central Asia. Next slide. So Central Asia is located in the area called sometimes the third pole. You have Arctic and Antarctic, where there are largest reserves of fresh water, and the third largest reserve of fresh water is the glaciers in this area. And the unfortunate fact is that the glaciers are melting so fast that the predictions are that within our lifetimes, they will almost disappear, and a quarter of the world's population will be impacted by that. Next slide. And another worrying fact is that the global warming about which Martin mentioned is actually impacting this part of the world the hardest. So you can see the dark spot over Central Asia, and that's the map produced by NASA by observing the climate over 70 years. Next slide.
And just for the note that the darker, the browner, the more the anomaly is.
Correct. And what is this leading to? We are witnessing now anomalies and extreme weathers all over the world. For example, we just saw extreme heats in South Asia, and I think last week in Europe there were floods and extreme heat. And in Central Asia, this is just a picture, but I will later show you the video, put a link to the video. This is actually unprecedented situation when a glacier actually collapsed, and there were tourists climbing this in this area in Kyrgyzstan, which was very safe, and almost got. Luckily, they survived, but the kind of situation was extremely grave, and this is unfortunate that it's not going to be unique, and glaciers are disappearing. Next slide. And so to be able to monitor climate better and to have better predictions of the situations, together with colleagues at ICTP, we launched this project on Internet of Things, network of sensors, collecting data on climate and sending the information over LoRaWAN to long distance. And at the moment, the climate is monitored by stationary weather stations, which are expensive. They are very heavy. They need electricity and communications channel to function and to send information. They need people to monitor, to stand by these weather stations and collect the information. The frequency of data is, I think, 1 in 6 hours. So every 6 hours, a person comes to the sensors and writes down the information and then sends it. And limited set of measurements. So all these limitations are the reason that there are very few weather stations. So for a whole country of Kyrgyzstan, there are only 80 stations. And the technology that we are trying is an IoT network of climate sensors, which are really inexpensive. So the cost can be 10 times, 20 times less expensive than the ordinary stations. They're very lightweight, so you can carry them to kind of long distances. They have batteries that last years, up to 10 years, and they use LoRaWAN communication technology, so they don't need access to the internet. They can work autonomously and can send real-time data. If you want, they can send very, very frequently, but of course, it will come at the cost of battery running faster. And in addition to kind of ordinary set of climate conditions like weather, wind speed, those kinds, There are additional things that you can measure. You can put sensors under the ground and measure the moisture and temperature of soil underground. You can put it in the water to measure the quality of water. So there are more applications of these sensors. And of course, there is a debate which we should use, and we decided, next slide, please. So we wanted to test, are these technologies really a magic silver bullet or magic green bullet that would help us monitor climate and prepare for the disasters better? Next slide. So first of all, we decided to install this new technology by the existing weather station. So on the left, you can see a picture of us installing these IoT sensors by the ordinary weather station to see how the data collected by these sensors correlates with the data collected with existing weather stations. And the installation is being done by Ermanno, who together with Marco flew in from Italy. And as you can see in the picture on the right, it's usually one person doing all the work, and all of us are watching him do it. Next slide, please. Second application that we wanted to test is the landslide monitoring. Kyrgyzstan, being a mountainous country, experiences a lot of landslides. Sometimes these are very tragic and people's lives are lost because they occur suddenly. So we've been burying sensors under the soil in active landslide areas and kind of monitoring the situation. Next slide. Another application is floods forecasting. Another major disaster that happens in mountainous countries like Kyrgyzstan is, and not just mountainous, like in Europe too, you can see floods happening. We've been installing additional weather stations in areas where there are no existing sensors. So now the Ministry of Emergency Situations receives information real time about the situation in this area. And if they see like the water levels going up or moisture accumulating, they come in advance and do the forceful kind of letting down of excess water. And by that, they are preventing floods. Next slide. Previous slide, please. Another major issue is happening is you saw in the picture how glaciers are melting, and this is causing or creating many mountain lakes. So the Ministry of Emergency Situation now says that if there were maybe a dozen of mountain lakes over the past few years in Kyrgyzstan, thousands of new lakes are appearing because of the melting. And some of these lakes are located in near major human settlements. If they outburst, then there could be very bad damaging consequences. So we are also installing sensors in very high mountainous areas to monitor potential mountain lake outbursts.
And electricity is provided by the solar cells, or?
Say it again, Martin.
The electricity is provided by the solar cells?
Yes. So many of these locations do not have access to the electricity, and also they don't have access to any communications. So although the sensors themselves, they don't need access to power, they have batteries. The gateway, which collects data from all these sensors, needs a solar panel. So we needed to install solar panels for that. And my colleagues and I have been exercising in the gym on a daily basis to be able to climb these very high altitudes, like 4,000 meters and above. Next slide. And another interesting application that we would like to test, and in Trieste, we participated in a workshop on extreme communications and learned that in Africa, scientists are trying to monitor wildlife with smart sensors. In Scandinavia, scientists are trying to see how to trace deer and other wildlife. So in Central Asia, we'd like to see if we can monitor such unique animals to this region as snow leopards and yaks. Next slide. So this is just a kind of screenshot of the dashboard that we are making openly accessible. And I'd like to highlight here that our research is actually called deploying open and secure LoRaWAN infrastructure. So today, if you want to get access to climatic data from weather agencies, you actually have to buy it. And in Kyrgyzstan, it's actually very analog. You have to write a letter, and this agency will send you on a A4 format information. Then that you have to actually enter into the computer, whereas this network that we've set up produces this information, and all this data is available online. And the other aspect we'd like to do is we want to test it, how secure it is, this information and this network. And just before our session in this room, there was a session on the cybersecurity, including of IoT devices. So our next step will be to kind of test this network to see how it can withstand the cybersecurity threats. And this information, all this data is available freely to anyone. So speaking about multi-stakeholder approach, government agencies, private sector, scientists can use this data and produce actual applications. So we'd like, in addition to just producing dashboard, we'd like to kind of produce meaningful applications for, let's say, farmers in these areas, or for people to have early warning. So this is what's in the plans. Next slide, please. And this is just a kind of basic picture of the architecture or the topology of how we are deploying it. So it's not really complex. And we think that this kind of application of IoT LoRaWAN communications can be a game changer in climate monitoring. Next slide. And this is practically the conclusion of my presentation. And here I just wanted to highlight the kind of very important factor that Martin mentioned about the multi-stakeholder approach. This project became possible because of the collaboration of different organizations and agencies, donors like ISOC foundations, scientific community and technical community, support of the government agencies. And we're looking forward to collaborating with different organizations and to scale up this project. And to highlight this photo, this is actually a training that our colleagues did for scientific community in Kyrgyzstan. And you can see that this picture is very gender unbalanced. And I was pleasantly surprised that the scientific community, climate scientific community in Kyrgyzstan, there are many women scientists. And I really like this kind of gender imbalance. So I recently joined the organization called Global Digital Inclusion Partnership, where we would like to close the gender balance. So that's one more message I wanted to pass on. And next slide, please. Yeah, so this was the conclusion of my presentation, and later on I'll be happy to respond to any questions. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Talant, for an excellent presentation. Inspirational, but also very real. So helping us to understand what happens in the world. The way you applied it is also something that could be applied in other areas where very little infrastructure is currently present. So that's also a very important part. Now, with that, I'd love to move to Joanna, who is also closely following the UN developments, and hear from you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I loved Talent's presentation. Thank you so much, Talent. I have no cats and no kids in my presentation. But for the purpose of this session, I embrace the role of both the gender diversity and being the lawyer in the room to argue that all the points that Martin kindly mentioned and other colleagues will be discussing further in this session are not just voluntary practices. They're not just good practices, but they are actually enshrined in law. And since we do have good governmental representation always at the EuroDIG meetings, if there are colleagues in the room wondering, well, is this part of our policy? Is this something that we need to consider as per existing international law commitments? Then the answer to that question is yes. As Martin kindly mentioned, I work at a university in Poland, and my day job is trying to research how international law applies to cyberspace with various aspects, and the context of sustainability and IoT is very close to my heart. I'll try to exemplify that as we move forward. I'll try to be brief. I understand we only have 60 minutes, but I will try to make 5 points to argue that sustainability in the context we're discussing in this session is not just a question of an ethical commitment, but it is actually a legal obligation. Now, if you look at the concept of sustainability, of sustainable development, it is a principle of international law. We assume that all states are equal. We can go back to the question of the binding nature of international law, and we assume that all states have agreed and accepted for themselves specific commitments to ensure that they do have indeed equal footing on the global arena. Now, if you were trying to argue to the contrary, I understand that the current geopolitical situation is challenging. This is usually a conversation I have at latest during the second class with my international law students, but that's not where I'm headed with this presentation. Let's just agree that as we stand in the global community, international law applies, and it is built upon the principle of sovereign equality of states. It is often referred to as the principle of equity, so we look forward to ensuring that all states, and effectively our communities, are treated equally. We have reflected this assumption and the policy behind the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, this audience needs no further background to reiterate what these mean. We have therefore a very complex framework identifying specific obligations of states that needs to be then trickled down into national laws to ensure that everyone can enjoy the benefits of contemporary societies on equal footing. So if we were to seek the commitment for governments to ensure this sustainability, we could point to the principle of equity, and we could point to states' due diligence in ensuring that everyone is treated fairly and equally. We don't have to list the actions that states need to take, but rather we can assess them on their efforts and make sure they take all necessary measures to ensure such equity. SDGs, as already said, are a quite specific framework, a quite specific list. I know that my distinguished co-panelists will look into these in more detail, and the work of both the leader for this the Dynamic Coalition, but the Dynamic Coalition itself exemplifies this. We view them as the tool to ensure fairness and justice, and we do apply them to global policies. You could view the multi-stakeholder model and the networks behind it as a reiteration of this global approach to sustainable development. It does include human rights, although they are not specifically the focus of this panel. But there is an assumption that, for example, when it comes to the security of data on your Internet of Things, your data will be protected universally according to the same principles, and we do have enshrined those in international human rights law. If we were trying to point to a specific SDG, then obviously we would be looking into the Sustainable Development Goal mentioned under number 9. We're looking to ensure that infrastructures are resilient. They do include IoT-based or inclusive infrastructures. We want to make sure that those infrastructures promote an inclusive and sustainable access to the internet, and they foster innovation. The example that Talent just kindly shared fits right into this narrative. We would view it, therefore, as mandatory for the international community to ensure that this innovative approach to disaster prevention is facilitated on equal footing. There is a need to invest in those novel solutions for sustainable development, and there is a need for states to act with due care to ensure that infrastructures are resilient. We would derive these specific commitments directly from SDG 9. Now, international law provides us with a toolbox on what it means that states need to act with all available means to ensure sustainability. When we look at specific components of the IoT networks, we would then apply these commitments, these obligations to every chain, every link of that chain. We would expect states to both ensure compliance with human rights, but also balance it with security, something that Martin kindly mentioned in his introduction. If we do have those of you in the room who have looked into the application of international law in cyberspace, the most common question is, how do we apply it? What does it mean that international law applies to cyberspace? We agree it does, but what does it mean practically? Now, good news, we actually have quite a few recommendations, toolboxes, and we have at the United Nations level the toolbox, a set, as you can see here, of 11 norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace and confidence building measures to implement them. So if you were to seek specific actions to be taken by states universally to ensure SDG 9, well, there is the detailed list of actions that they are expected to implement. It's easy for me to speak on this in Europe, since Europe very strongly supports these norms. We are looking to have it implemented possibly through a framework, maybe eventually through a convention or a treaty, but that is still a very open conversation. We argue we don't really need another treaty because these are already binding. Is it just a European approach? Luckily, we're not alone. There is a very well-established transatlantic alliance. Our friends in the US also firmly believe in responsible state behavior in cyberspace. There is a recent document you might have seen coming directly from the Department of State, confirming the allegiance of the United States to responsible state behavior in cyberspace, including the commitment to sustainable development goals. How would the US implement it? Again, through a variety of means. This includes the implementation of international law. This explicitly mentions the 11 norms that I just presented on that lovely, colorful slide. It includes confidence building measures, which is something that Talent implements locally, also through cyber capacity building, so spreading the word on what it means to ensure sustainable access. So there seems to be at least a transatlantic consensus, and Talent's example shows us that these norms are indeed implemented universally. I know we have colleagues in the room who are working diligently on the Global Digital Compact. First, initially its development, then hopefully in the near future, its implementation. And it seeks to confirm this commitment to sustainable development, also applicable to the Internet of Things. To summarize, that's the last point that I would like to make in this brief intervention. This dynamic coalition is particularly important for us to better understand what it means to implement international law in cyberspace, to ensure that further development is sustainable. Because the discussion we are yet to have here today and all the documents that arise out of it may be policy recommendations, maybe confidence building measures, capacity building activities, will help us better specify, better understand what it means in practice to ensure sustainable internet access, also when it comes to fighting to countering potential environmental impacts. So this is to frame this discussion in that specific context. And I did briefly mention I'm deeply impressed with the work that Talent is doing, also because he is a fellow from the Internet Society Foundation. The work that we do here at the Research Center, the LOT Cyber Hub, implements these broad principles I was just trying to describe, but applicable to a different component of Internet infrastructures. We are looking into satellite connectivity to low Earth orbit satellites. We're using this specific narrative. We want to make sure that Internet connectivity, Internet access is sustainable. We're building this argument on SDG 9 as well. And we're trying to foster capacity. We'll be, for example, hosting in 2 weeks' time a summer school here in which to make sure that we know in detail what it means to ensure sustainability through international law, also when it comes to internet infrastructures and the Internet of Things. that's all I have. I think I'm still on time. Thank you very much, Martin. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. Thanks a lot. I see some pensive faces in particular when you talked about the need, the kind of due diligence obligation to consider using this and making this possible. I don't see direct hands, and for the sake of time, I'd love to add on Jonathan's contribution. And towards the end, please start writing down your questions so we can go effectively through them. Jonathan, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, and thank you very much, Joanna and Talent. Those are brilliant things. I won't attempt to get anywhere close to that level of coherence or detail, because one of the advantages of going last or next to last is that you get to react to things that people have already said. Now, as Martin hinted, my background is in economics and complexity science, and let's say data science, and particularly in regulation. So I had basically 4 points I wanted to make and a couple of observations about things that have come up already. So the first point is something of a theoretical point, which is that sustainability challenges, and it may be an obvious point, sustainability challenges are emergent behaviors. We can't always know about them until they become irrevocable. And the point at which we need to respond to them is at the level of things that are weak signals. So technically speaking, strongly emergent behavior cannot be anticipated, although it could be predicted if you had enough information. And because it's the correlation of signals in many different places that tell you that something global or systemic is happening, this tells you right away that you need something like an Internet of Things approach. You need sensors to collect data from a whole bunch of different contexts and data science tools to put them together. And then you need to be able to act both globally at the level of governance frameworks, for example, but also locally in terms of the kinds of interventions that you can do. Now, in some cases, you can do it with local activity. So, for example, if there's a problem of a lake overflowing, you can tell people in the area and mitigate the damage that that causes. But that is responding to a specific instance, whereas the distribution of all of those instances may be shifting. And so something at a higher, more systemic level needs to come into place. But when people react to these local disasters, they become aware of them in a way that perhaps they weren't before. And they then become open to coordinating with other people around the world in ways that they would not have done before. So it builds awareness and consciousness, and the use of these local systems and projects gives people a sense of ownership and common purpose, which is very valuable when we move beyond the level of, let's say, laws and formal frameworks or contracts or technological design into the level of actually applying these things. And I mention the law specifically because Joanna usefully used the word ensure. As an economist, I would immediately and globally replace ensure with encourage, because none of the things that we're meant to be ensuring actually exist in a reliable and systemic fashion. But of course, like sustainability itself, they're not destinations, they're directions in which we ought to go. So just from my personal perspective, I think that that linkage is quite important. The second point I wanted to make was the linkage between sustainability as a concept, for example, in the Brundtland sense, in which economic, socio-political, natural, and laterally cultural sustainability are recognized as domains in their own but are interdependent, and technological change, because technological change can automate our response to certain kinds of things, and it can build in certain kinds of robustness and resilience. And so part of this is that one of the domains will affect the other domain. And the reason I mention that is that one of the things that climate change itself has brought, and certainly the development of the IoT has brought, is the involvement of economic agents with economic motivations. Under certain circumstances, notably not including global public goods, economic systems can be aligned with the things that people care about. But when you have these big global public goods, what happens is, and we've all seen it, is that the possibilities of the IoT get monetized and converted into value propositions for corporations, which then move the dial on government policy. The same is true with sustainability challenges, particularly climate change. And what we've observed with things like photovoltaics is the growth of large industries that are not really addressed at resolving the problems, but rather of making money out of the way that we care about and experience those problems and the way things move. In the same way as momentum traders in the financial market don't care about where the financial market is going, it's enough that it moves. And by intervening in that way, they actually change the dynamics of the system so that it may not become, let's say, self-organizing and self-healing. Another thing I wanted to mention, which is not economic thinking versus, let's say, or as compared to sustainability thinking, but one of the ways in which people think about the IoT is dominated by cybersecurity concerns. And cybersecurity concerns are concerned with minimizing risks, compartmentalizing risks, at least keeping them away from the systems that you care about. Sort of zero-sum, almost selfish types of thinking. And so the way we manage systemic risk is not intellectually compatible with the way we might manage our individual risks once we see them as individual risks. Sustainability is almost the opposite. Sustainability is concerned with things that we all share and requires a sense of cooperative behavior, but there is a kind of sharp dividing line between the two types of thinking, the security type and the sustainability type. And we could see it in the climate change world with the contrast between the adaptation community and the mitigation community. In other words, at a certain point, you think things have got so bad that I've got to look out for myself, and I don't have the luxury anymore of relying on cooperative experimentation, shared grants of sovereignty, and things like that. So there is an issue here about, a bit like the old thing about the two nations, the Republic of Science and the Kingdom of Industry. We have something like that in this, and IoT in relation to sustainability sits squarely across the middle of that divide. And I think that that's something we might want to think about. And then finally, there's a question about the deployment of these IoT systems. And as Talent argued persuasively, a degree of autonomy is needed, but an autonomous system will respond in response to its own objectives, whether those are programmed into a reinforcement learning device or simply hard-coded into the device itself. But as the world changes, they need to recognize and respond to those changes. And that may require a different type of programming of these devices that gives them a sense of their common destiny and purpose. So the autonomy, there are ways that you can reprogram these devices to have a sense of duty to the system as a whole that transcends their literal functional definition under certain specific conditions. So just as people wake up and begin thinking differently when what was just sort of normal background behavior becomes a crisis and captures their attention, you can do the same technologically when you program intelligent autonomous devices, not simply to be focused on the reasons why people initially deployed them. So a device which collects information for one purpose may be encouraged to collect and share it for other purposes as well, if other devices or other systems can make use of that information. We saw this with human beings. We can see it as well, I suppose, with these devices. And then finally, I wanted to make a couple of points relating to, in particular, to norms and engagement and ownership.
Please keep it short.
Yeah, very short. It is true that within the sustainability and technological community, we share a perspective on the world. We should be very careful about projecting that onto the rest of the world. And the recent results, particularly the youth non-vote for green issues in the European elections, should remind us that other people at other stages in their life with other companions to exchange ideas with, see things differently. And then that brings us to the final thing, which is that the use of these IoT devices in shared community-based projects gives a sense of engagement and shared ownership, which can allow us to embed these values that we talk about in the things that we do day to day, and maybe even in our political behavior. So that's me. I'm done. Thank you very much for listening.
It was a very strong finish, I would say. Involving people makes that they care and help make it happen, up and beyond the funding, which is the issue in itself. So with that, also noting that remark that you made, that some may be in it for making money instead of providing solutions. Unfortunately, recently history showed you right with the many court cases currently to those who are willing to help out with the COVID cases and are now in court because of false intents and making a lot of money. Next to all the good things that happened. With that,
at least they do wind up in court, which is something.
The world is changing in that way. Accountability becomes more prevalent in many parts of the world because of also increased transparency and traceability. The more we do on the internet, the more it's traceable and maybe transparent. So with that, excellent place to hear about what does it mean from the perspective of core internet values.
Well, one of the
5 minutes.
Yeah, well, 5 minutes, that's one thing. One of the things that's difficult is speaking after Jonathan, because he says things more eloquently than any way I could express it. And he says all the right things. I'm the chair of the Dynamic Coalition on Core Internet Values. And what we look at, what we have looked at for quite some time, is what makes the internet what it is. How is the internet such an innovative system that brings more innovation, and that with originally very little governance managed to actually thrive and become what it is and become so successful. And we found, of course, that the internet is based on a certain number of values, a certain number of characteristics that made it, gave it the ability to become so successful. So we're looking at things like common standards, for example. So, you know, TCP/IP, which is the sort of base protocol being used that every single machine out there could use and could therefore use to connect to the internet. And I said machine, not computer, since we are dealing now with Internet of Things, and Internet of Things is on the internet. You've got the common protocols, you've got the open network, you've got the end-to-end, the robust and reliable network, and it's also, and that's quite important, free of centralized control. Because I see many of you might have not lived through the telecom monopolies of the 70s and 80s, and I see those who have are probably putting their head in their hands thinking, oh my goodness, that was really hard. Back in the days when, in order to connect something onto any type of telecommunication network, you needed to go through a very lengthy process by which you would need to have approval for this device to be connected. And as a result, the innovative side of things was absolutely curbed, killed. Sometimes it would take over a year for any device to be put on there, and it would cost thousands and thousands of dollars. Now we're seeing that this doesn't exist anymore because the telecom monopolies are, of course, broken up, and the internet allows you to connect pretty much anything to it. And that's what gave the IoT its hand, its help, its wings, I would say, in being able to thrive as quickly as the internet has. Now, there is one concept which we did discuss in our Dynamic Coalition in 2017, and interestingly enough, it was introduced by Vint Cerf, which was the right to be safe. And the concept of safety was never something that was initially big on the internet because everyone knew everyone else. And, you know, when you're a big family, you don't really put locks inside your house. Well, when you're a happy family, but then as you start having more and more people involved, you might start needing locks here and there. And this is how cybersecurity came to be.
The bathroom.
A bit of the bathroom might be one, but if you have an actual proper lock with a key, perhaps, yeah, who knows? You can lock someone in the bathroom, can't you? Sorry, I didn't say that. Now, the point is that I think that if we're looking at the concept of the right to being safe, it's something that is particularly important when it comes down to networks of IoT devices, especially when you look at the sheer number of IoT devices that you require. And here, of course, in the current context that we're speaking about with regards to climate sensors, we're dealing here with a global capacity. Talent has provided us with details of things happening around the world, and with a potential for these devices, perhaps the controlling device of these devices, to be hacked in some way, to be used for nefarious purposes. And of course, we're well aware that cybersecurity has a big thing to play in those things. And Wout, of course, Wout's work on this with his colleagues is really, really important. But what I think is equally as important in this is to make sure that we don't end up in the direction of over-regulation of these of the sensors themselves and of what we're seeing today being spread across the world. Maybe about 10 years ago, I saw something which was really helpful in Japan. Those sensors that people had at home. So it was like a telephone device that people had at home. I can't remember the name of it, but it was effectively an earthquake detection network. So it was make an array of these sensors across Japan, and you could effectively, through the differences in I don't know exactly how it works, but you could actually have a certain amount of time, and the device would also serve as an early alert sensor. And I think that we're looking at this sort of thing here in a longer term, having sensors across the globe to detect global warming and less costly tracking of this global warming, because there are still many that believe that this is untrue. There is no global warming. Look, it's June and it's not too hot at the moment. There you go. Well, somewhere it is, but not here.
Let's not go into that discussion.
Let's not go into that. But the point is that if we continue with the same set of standards that as we have now, where there have been an enormous amount of innovation going on throughout the world, without requiring this centralized control, this legal laws, etc., to regulate this, we're probably, and I'm just saying probably because I don't really know whether we are, but we probably are better off than if we had something that was more top down and less bottom up. So that's all I can say in regards to core internet values and core IoT values, if I could say it in this way.
Yes, thank you very much. Recognize the underlying principles, including interoperability, of course, both of the data sets and the IoT. So at this point, there is time for one or two questions. And a question that came up for me was, in particular, when Jonathan explained that Joanna's ensure should be read as encourage. Joanna, would you agree with that, or do you think Jonathan may overlook something?
I love that conversation. I would love to have it with Jonathan. That's why I linked it to due diligence. So I would argue, and I'm glad to have that argument off the record or on the record, that due diligence implies we can actually expect the states to act with all necessary measures. So encourage is probably a little bit lighter if my English knowledge allows me to read that correctly. And ensure means we can actually hold them responsible if they fail to act with all means at their disposal. I would argue for the stronger variant of that. So I would argue that due diligence implies we expect states to do all they can to ensure, in this case, sustainability. But I can sense a research paper coming out of that little comment, for which I am much indebted to Jonathan. That's a brief response. I know we're out of time, but again, I'm glad to have that conversation. Thank you for circling back to that, Martin.
For those who don't see it, the UK government is nodding on this remark.
One tiny one-word response,
Please.
which is the word duty. That what we expect of governments, what we hold them to, their duty towards us and towards the world. It sits somewhere between what we're sure will happen and what we merely want them to encourage. So there are things in that interim space, and that notion of fiduciary duty or political duty, I think, may help us to move there a bit.
I see two hands here in the room. Maybe you can come closer to make sure that you're well understood. And we have both remarks and then we round it off.
Okay.
Please, Nigel Hickson.
Yes, thank you, Nigel Hickson, UK government. I mean, I haven't been in all the sessions, so I haven't caught all the nuances, but really on the internet values, I wanted to ask whether they are being unraveled, you know, as we speak. I mean, we see national governments, we see regional governments imposing regulation. There's a debate about whether net neutrality is important anymore. I mean, for years, 20 years ago, many of us fought in the trenches because it was the only way to secure an open internet. And now governments don't think it's so important anymore.
Well, I guess if I could answer very quickly, are governments thinking that eroding internet values and changing the way the internet works radically, is that going to affect the internet positively or negatively as far as innovation is concerned? Unfortunately, I don't think enough governments think about innovation. They think more about protection and safety and other things. But innovation is something that's kind of now pushed because it's probably taken for granted, unfortunately. And it isn't, it shouldn't be.
Maybe so more in some parts of the world than other parts. And Europe is for sure, seems to be very focused on values.
Very, yeah, exactly.
So with that, next question by Wouter Natris, who's been running the previous session, which also included a lot of emphasis on the security aspects. Please, Wouter.
Yes, Wouter Natris, DC IS3C. First comment on duty. I think what we introduced or trying to introduce in our dynamic coalition is duty of care, duty to care. So our industry partners actually delivering a duty to care, and should governments monitor that in a better way, because that could help us put pressure on industry to deploy the standards and security. The second is what I noticed over the whole day with all the dynamic coalitions, first on DNS, and then I can't remember, but the topic was NIS3, Maarten, myself, you, Olivier, we all seem to sort of turn around the same sort of topic, which is on security. Shouldn't we try to do something together in IGF and Riyadh and make sure that there's more emphasis on the work that we are doing, but also on the common work that we're doing? So perhaps we should sit together sometime online and see if we can pull something like that off. So just as a suggestion.
Works for me, thumbs up.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that. I hear already the sound in the room next door, which happens to be the coffee room here in Vilnius. So with that, I would really like to thank the speakers very much for their excellent exposés and good discussion. And last but not least, I would also like to recognize Jolly McFly, who's been streaming this session again to the world. Without your service, Jolly, much less knowledge and understanding would be shared. So warm regards from this room as well. So thank you, everybody. For those in this room, coffee outside. For those at their own homes, I really appreciate your excellent contributions. And we'll make a short report on this as we do, and this will be input to the IGF in Riyadh later this year. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Enjoy your coffee, guys.
Thank you.